Chapter 1. This season was going to be different. The long-awaited day of the festival had finally arrived, and for Lady Sophie Kimberly, radiant in both beauty and spirit, it was to be an escape from the solitude of her family's grand estate. Now, with the arrival of guests and the buzz of festivities, she felt an excitement stir within her. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her gaze sweeping down to the reception hall below. The air was heavy with the fragrance of flowers, their vibrant petals garnishing every surface and bursting with color and life. Twinkling lights adorned the grand chandeliers overhead, casting a soft, golden glow that seemed to dance across the stone floors. As well as visiting dignitaries, the whole neighborhood had been invited. As the gates had swung open, the estate had been filled with the energy of joyous anticipation. The usually imposing courtyard now felt like the heart of the gathering, alive with the sounds of merrymaking, laughter spilling from every corner as guests gathered in small clusters, mingling and sharing in the festive spirit. Sophie's father, the Earl of Kimberley, and her stepmother, Countess Florence, greeted attendees at the entrance. The women in their beautiful gowns, the men in their tailored suits, all moving with purpose through the reception hall. The sounds of the musicians in the ballroom stirred in the background, inviting more guests to join the growing celebration. Sophie watched the lively scene unfold as her gaze shifted, taking in the chaperones stationed along the edges, ever watchful of their charges, while groups of gentlemen gathered in conversation, their voices rising in laughter. Sophie descended gracefully, aware of admiring glances but uninterested. This season, she would not surrender her heart, as expected of a girl of her age. Her vintage gown, a pale pink satin embroidered with delicate golden flowers, was the work of a Paris couturier whose name had slipped from her memory. She was certain that it would be the envy of every young woman present. The gown was designed to flatter her figure, with a décolletage that hinted at allure while remaining tastefully understated. It cinched at the waist just enough to create a graceful silhouette without feeling constrictive, and the fabric cascaded elegantly over her hips, gliding around her legs with each step she took. Her younger sister, Josephine, arrived at her side, beaming with excitement. Dressed in a gown of soft lilac silk that shimmered in the golden light of the chandeliers, Josephine practically glowed with unrestrained excitement. Her dark curls, wild despite best efforts, bounced with each step. A wide grin lit her face as she slipped her arm through Sophie's, linking them together with an effortless intimacy that spoke of years of sisterly devotion. "You feel it, don't you?" Josephine whispered conspiratorially, leaning in close. "The air is electric tonight. I swear, Sophie, something marvelous is bound to happen." Her voice trembled with eager delight, like a melody on the verge of crescendo. Sophie's lips curved into a reserved smile, though her gaze swept warily over the bustling hall. "Yes," she admitted softly. "Tonight is certainly different." Josephine gave a light laugh, nudging her sister playfully. "Different? That's the best you can manage?" She sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Honestly, sometimes I think you were born twice my age." "Someone has to keep their head while you're busy dreaming up adventures," Sophie countered gently, though there was warmth in her tone. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like? Living before the war, before the great departure?" Ignoring her sister's warning. "For you, probably a great expedition." Sophie cast a quick glance over her shoulder, lowering her voice. "Please, Josephine, tonight, just be careful. Not everyone here has good intentions." Josephine rolled her eyes, though her smile faltered just slightly. "You sound like father. Maybe because he's right." Sophie's grip on her sister's arm tightened fractionally. "People talk. They plot. And they'll gladly ruin anyone who stands in their way. Even you." For a fleeting moment, Josephine's radiant confidence wavered, but she shook it off with practiced ease. "Let them try," her grin returning, though there was an edge to it now. "I'd like to see anyone manage that." Sophie sighed, knowing her sister's resolve was a force not easily tempered. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise to try," Josephine said teasingly, pressing a kiss to Sophie's cheek before releasing her arm. "But tonight's not for caution, dear sister. Tonight's for possibility." Sophie rubbed her arms, the warmth of the evening failing to ease the chill creeping over her. Watching her sister vanish into the swirling crowd, she couldn't shake a lingering unease. Yes, tonight anything could happen, and that was precisely what worried her most. As she stood watching the guests entering the ballroom, she caught snippets of conversations. An elderly couple strolled by, engrossed in a deep discussion. Imagine a world where we still had medicine when we needed it. My grandson says the shipments from the colonies aren't enough anymore, the man sighs, the lady's response unheard as they disappear into the crowd. Sophie had heard the rumors, a quiet murmur of discontent building beneath the polished smiles and practiced laughter. This was how it had always been. The ball, the month-long festivities, a carefully rehearsed tribute to survival. A tradition so old that no one dared question it. Except. Sophie's fingers tightened around the silk of her gown. Except for those who remembered. Who whispered about what life had been like before. The memory of her lessons flickered in her mind, fragments of her teacher's voice weaving through the recollection. They had described a world fractured by relentless conflict and environmental ruin. As Earth's battered landscape struggled to heal, a choice was offered. Those with the will to escape could leave for a distant planet, light years away, where the promise of advanced technology and a fresh start shimmered like a beacon in the void. For those who remained, they would embrace a simpler existence, reuse what was left behind, and live off the land. The one concession is a decennial shipment from the New World with life-sustaining medicines. A solemn pact with Earth's remaining doctors, whose singular duty was to keep alive the spark of medical progress, though nothing more. Over time, humanity receded into a new order reminiscent of an age both lost and reborn. The lords now govern vast expanses of territory and enforce laws that echo with the weight of ancient tradition. Do no evil, hurt no man, and be generous to all no matter their position in life. The Earls, guardians of health, education, and community welfare, tend to the people with a blend of compassion and discipline. And the farmers, whose tireless work nurtures the land and raises the cattle. All three have earned a place of respect and equality among their peers. Chapter 2. The Grand Ballroom stood as a testament to both resilience and tradition, a breathtaking fusion of old-world elegance and the ingenuity required to survive in this reborn age. Towering floor-to-ceiling windows, framed by heavy velvet drapes, lined the vast hall, their intricate embroidery depicting a history that few now fully remembered. Above, a massive chandelier, forged from the salvaged remains of an ancient aircraft, commanded the ceiling. Its intricately twisted metal gleamed under the soft light of hundreds of carefully placed bulbs, their glow a gift from the sun's energy, stored during the day and released into the night. Music filled the air, played by a small ensemble whose instruments, some newly crafted, others carefully preserved relics, produced melodies both timeless and haunting. The dance floor, a stunning patchwork of salvaged wood, gleamed beneath the swirling feet of lords, ladies, and townsfolk. Each board told a story of its own, repurposed from forgotten places and painstakingly restored to life. Beyond the ballroom's gilded grandeur, a set of ornate double doors, their wood reinforced with salvaged metal and intricate engravings, stood wide open, leading into the next grand chamber, the banqueting hall. If the ballroom was a place of grace and movement, the banqueting hall was a display of abundance and power. The vast chamber stretched before the guests, its long, heavy wooden tables laden with an extravagant feast, roasted meats, stews rich with herbs grown in the estate's sprawling greenhouses, and delicate pastries made from grain still scarce enough to be a luxury. Exotic spices, carried in the rare decennial shipments from the distant colonies, perfumed the air, mingling with the scent of smoldering beeswax candles. Between the banqueting hall and the ballroom, guests moved at their leisure, some retreating to the dance floor, drawn by the music's spell, while others lingered over their wine, engaged in hushed negotiations or whispered intrigues that would shape the coming season's alliances. This was the heart of power, the place where fortunes were made, where futures were sealed with a glance or a careless word. The Earl, despite his efforts to enjoy the evening, remained distant. His face bore the faint traces of a melancholy that seemed to cling to him, no matter how vigorously he tried to push it away. Even as he exchanged pleasantries with his guests, there was a certain abstraction in his gaze, as if his mind wandered far from the festivities. The Countess Florence smoothed the fabric of her gown before stepping onto the dance floor, her movements as practiced as her smile. Yet, her beauty was not enough to silence the jealousy gnawing at her heart. Her eyes, though outwardly warm, often turned toward the young ladies in the room, especially Sophie and Josephine. There was something so effortlessly enchanting about them, an air of innocence to their grace, which irked her. As she spun, her gaze flickered toward the Earl's only son, the Honorable Philippe Kimberly. At 15, he was tall for his age, with the same strong jawline, piercing blue eyes, and wavy dark hair as his father. His finely tailored navy coat, accented with silver embroidery, highlighted the broadness of shoulders. Though still boyish in some ways, Philippe carried himself with a poise beyond his years, his quiet confidence already turning heads. He extended his hand to Lady Martha de Lanzio, a striking girl with golden curls cascading down her back. As they took to the floor, the watching guests smiled knowingly. It was a polite, innocent pair, nothing more, but Philippe's natural charm hinted at the formidable presence he was destined to become. Lady Martha danced gracefully, though her flushed cheeks and darting eyes revealed her awareness of the attention. Her parents had taken great care to ensure that no one would mistake her for being older than her 14 years. A silent reminder she was too young for suitors or whispered proposals, though not too young to be noticed. The Countess's gaze settled on Josephine Kimberly, who, at 16, was already blossoming into a striking young woman. Like her siblings, she had the family's signature dark hair, but in every other way, she was her mother's daughter. While Sophie embodied their father's aristocratic sharpness and Philippe his quiet strength, Josephine inherited the late Countess's softer beauty, wide, stormy blue eyes and a delicate bone structure that lent her an ethereal elegance. Her finely drawn features glowed in the ballroom's golden light. Florence, the current Countess Kimberly, regarded her stepdaughter with barely concealed disdain. Josephine was not just a living reminder of the Earl's first love but a young woman whose natural grace Florence could never quite match. To Florence, the Earl himself was a relic, an awkward, ungraceful, and insufferably traditional. She had long since resigned herself to tolerating him for the wealth and security he provided, but she did not extend even that grudging patience to his daughters. It was clear to anyone watching that Josephine belonged in this world. Despite her youth, she carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she was meant to be. Florence, for all her efforts, could not deny it. And that, more than anything, made her loathe the girl even more. As the song ended, she curtsied to the man before stepping back and melting into the crowd of her friends. Florence's sharp gaze swept across the ballroom, searching the swirling figures for Sophie. As the eldest daughter of the Earl, she ought to be dancing, her presence expected, where eligible men might take notice. Yet, inexplicably, she was nowhere to be seen. A flicker of irritation prickled at the Countess as she craned her neck, searching. Then, there, at the very edge of the dance floor, half hidden by the throng of guests, Sophie stood engaged in quiet conversation with a young man. Florence narrowed her eyes, squinting as she tried to place him. Something about his posture, relaxed yet unmistakably composed, hinted at a breeding she should recognize. And yet, she did not. Turning to the woman beside her, she murmured, "Who is that?" A delicate lift of her gloved hand in Sophie's direction was all that was needed for her companion to follow her gaze. The woman, with a penchant for gossip, leaned in, delighted to supply the answer. "Oh, that's Earl Antonio Angoulême. The remaining son of Earl Arterius Angoulême, who, as you may recall, died quite suddenly a few months ago." Florence's expression remained unreadable, but inwardly, she was intrigued. The Angoulême line was one of old nobility, though not particularly well known in their social circles. A family of quiet wealth, withdrawn and enigmatic, their reputation was solid but unremarkable. The lady continued in a hushed, eager tone, clearly relishing the rare bit of novelty in tonight's proceedings. Before his father's death, the son never bothered with these sorts of events. A recluse, you might say. Kept himself tucked away in the family's southern estates, somewhere beyond the marshes, I believe. They say his lands once belonged to the old Baltic nobility. She gave Florence a knowing glance, as if that alone explained the young man's apparent disinterest in society. Florence pursed her lips, considering. A reclusive nobleman, suddenly emerging from the shadows after his father's death. That was interesting. And troubling. What could a man like that possibly want with Sophie? She let her gaze drift back to them. Sophie's head was tilted slightly as she listened, her expression unreadable but not disinterested. And the young Earl stood perfectly at ease, his dark eyes fixed on her with a quiet intensity. Florence tightened her grip on her wineglass, her nails pressing into the delicate stem. She found this interaction unsettling. This was a development she would need to watch very carefully. Chapter 3. Sophie's eyes had been drawn to the quiet figure lingering at the edges of the ballroom. While others moved with confidence, greeting one another with familiar ease, he remained apart, watching, hesitant, like an observer rather than a participant. Now, up close, he was even more striking. Earl Antonio Angoulême was a young man of 20, broad-shouldered and tall, his well-tailored suit doing little to hide the powerful frame beneath. His dark hair was thick and slightly unruly, as though he had run his fingers through it one too many times out of habit. He was handsome, though not in the polished way of the men Sophie was accustomed to. There was something rugged about him, an untamed quality, his features defined by strong lines, high cheekbones, a sharp jaw, and piercing eyes of an indeterminate shade between grey and blue. Yet despite his formidable appearance, he carried himself with uncertainty. The stiffness in his stance, the way his fingers flexed at his sides as though unsure what to do with them, betrayed his unease. Sophie, always attuned to such things, sensed the reluctance in him, the air of someone unaccustomed to this kind of event. She had approached without hesitation, and took her place next to him. Her voice light, warm, and inviting. "You look as though you'd rather be anywhere but here, my lord." Antonio startled slightly, as if pulled from his thoughts for a moment. He simply regarded her, as though weighing his words. Then he inclined his head slightly.
"My apologies, I am not particularly skilled at social gatherings, Lady Sophie."
His voice was low and rich, with the faintest trace of an unfamiliar accent, something foreign and refined yet softened. Sophie smiled up at him. "I suspected as much," she said, then lowering her voice, "You were standing looking as though you might make a run for it at any moment." He exhaled a quiet chuckle.
"Was it that obvious?"
Painfully, she teased, tilting her head. "And yet, here you are, enduring it. Why is that?" There was a pause, and something flickered in his eyes before he answered.
"It is expected of me."
A simple answer, a truthful one. Sophie studied him. He was unlike the other men in the room, self-assured gentlemen who lived for such occasions, who relished the politics of courtship and social maneuvering. Antonio did not. It was clear in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his gaze drifted toward the nearest exit as though mentally mapping his escape. She softened her tone. "Then allow me to offer an alternative reason to stay." His brow lifted slightly in question, but before he could speak, she extended her hand toward him, her fingers hovering just so, an unspoken invitation. "You mustn't spend the entire night observing, my lord. Come, let me show you." Antonio hesitated, his gaze flickering between Sophie's outstretched hand and the swirling figures on the dance floor. He stood frozen, his fingers twitched slightly at his side, as if unsure whether to accept her invitation or retreat to the shadows where he felt safest. He exhaled, his expression carefully guarded.
"I am not much of a dancer."
Sophie tilted her head, a teasing glint in her eyes. "Then that is all the more reason to dance, my lord. No one improves by standing still." Another pause. For a moment, it seemed as though he might refuse. Then, slowly, as if testing the limits of his own resolve, he reached for her hand. His touch was warm and hesitant, as if he had not allowed himself such closeness in a long time. A small smile touched Sophie's lips. "See? That wasn't so difficult, was it?" Antonio let out a quiet breath, his grip tightening just slightly.
"I suppose we shall see."
Delighted to have persuaded him to dance, Sophie drew a quiet breath as his fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, and unexpectedly grounding. A flutter of nerves rose within her, strange and disarming. He stood before her now, gaze unreadable, his touch firm yet gentle, as though testing his own resolve. She swallowed, willing herself to stay composed. Antonio's voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful.
"You are very kind, Lady Sophie."
She smiled. "Not kind, my lord. Merely determined." He huffed a small laugh.
"Determined to what?"
"To ensure you enjoy at least one dance this evening." His lips quirked, something resembling amusement softening his guarded expression. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he brought her hand to his lips in a gesture so old-fashioned it sent a strange warmth curling through her.
"As you wish," he murmured.
As they stepped onto the dance floor, she could feel the weight of every gaze upon her. She had danced countless times before,
had moved across these floors with suitors who whispered empty compliments.
But this was different. Antonio stood before her, still holding her hand as though he had not yet decided to dance or leave.
His touch was steady, his grip warm yet respectful, and though his posture remained stiff with the hesitance of a man unaccustomed to such displays, there was something almost endearing in his restraint.
The music began.
The first few steps were tentative, on his part, at least. Sophie, ever graceful, moved with the ease of one born to it, her dress sweeping the floor as she led him subtly through the steps.
Antonio followed, his movements controlled and precise, but lacking the natural flow of a seasoned dancer. "You're doing quite well," Sophie said softly, a small smile curving her lips.
Antonio exhaled, a quiet huff of laughter.
"That is a generous assessment." She tilted her head. "Not at all. You move with purpose."
He met her gaze, his lips quirking ever so slightly.
"I have spent my life learning discipline. Dancing was not considered a necessity."
"Really?"
she asked, raising a brow. "And what was?"
"Survival."
The single word hung between them.
Sophie's fingers tightened slightly against his as they turned in perfect unison, the music shifting into something softer, something that invited intimacy.
"You make it sound as though your life has been terribly difficult," she murmured. Antonio hesitated, as though debating how much to say. "Not difficult," he admitted at last. "Simply different." Sophie studied him, noting the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He had the air of a man who had seen much and shared little. "Do you miss it?" she asked.
"Your home?"
Antonio's lips pressed together briefly before he answered, "I do. And yet, it is not the same as I left it."
A shadow passed over his features, and Sophie, ever perceptive, decided not to push further.
Instead, she let the conversation flow to something lighter, something that would ease the tension in his shoulders.
"Well, my lord," she said with a teasing lilt, "if survival was your greatest skill, then I would say you have adapted remarkably well to this challenge." He glanced down at her, his mouth curving into something close to a smile.
"You are kind to say so. But if I must be truthful, I suspect it is you who makes this seem effortless."
Sophie's laughter was soft, but genuine.
"Perhaps. But I do believe you are enjoying yourself, just a little." His gaze sweeping over her face. "Perhaps." As the dance neared its end, the final notes of the music echoed softly throughout the ballroom.
In the ensuing stillness, Sophie lingered in that delicate afterglow, the gentle warmth of Antonio's touch still imprinted on her hand. With a graceful step back, she curtsied and then became keenly aware of the hush that had fallen over the room.
Everyone had been watching them.
A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and something else, something that made Sophie's skin prickle with awareness.
Sophie's stomach tightened. As they left the floor, Sophie caught sight of Countess Florence. Her stepmother was watching her, but not with the pride or delight that might have been expected.
No, there was something sharper in her eyes, something unreadable, a glint of admiration laced with resentment. The Countess Florence could not focus on anything but the way the Lord Angoulême looked at Sophie. There was something in the Lord's gaze, a depth, a warmth that unsettled her. She tried to convince herself that it was all harmless, that the young Earl was simply being polite. Every time she saw the Earl engage with Sophie, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the storm of emotions brewing within her. The joy of the evening seemed to mock her suffering. She joined a group sitting by the lake under a pavilion adorned with white silk and golden roses. The atmosphere was serene and beautiful, but her mind was far from at ease. The conversation buzzed with murmurs of admiration, but Countess Florence barely heard them. Her gaze remained fixed on Sophie and Antonio as they exchanged quiet words as they stood by the lake, the young Earl's expression softer than before. A smooth voice interrupted her thoughts. "A rather striking pair, don't you think?" Florence turned to find Count Durant beside her. He held his wine glass lazily, watching the young couple with interest. She forced a polite smile. "An unexpected pairing, perhaps." Durant chuckled, swirling his drink. "Unexpected?" "My dear Countess, I would say it was inevitable. A beautiful young lady with all the charm of her mother and a reserved young lord who has suddenly found himself in need of companionship." Florence's grip on her own glass tightened. You make it sound as though they are already destined for each other. The Count lifted a brow, clearly enjoying himself.
You mean to tell me you haven't considered it?
It would be quite the match, he, the last of his line, and she an unmatched beauty.
Florence's jaw clenched. Of course, she had noticed. How could she not?
The way Antonio's gaze lingered on Sophie, how he seemed at ease despite his initial discomfort in the crowd, Florence could not ignore the possibility that the young lord was beginning to see Sophie as more than just another girl at the ball.
She waved her fan dismissively. The girl is merely being polite. Sophie makes everyone feel welcome, it is her nature. Durant tilted his head, feigning deep thought.
Ah, yes.
But tell me, Countess, is it merely kindness, or is there something more?
Florence's stomach twisted.
She knew what he was doing, poking, prodding, searching for cracks in her composure.
She would not let him see them. Lord Angoulême is still grieving his father, she said coolly. It is only natural that he should seek distraction. Durant's smirk widened.
And Sophie is that distraction?
Florence's lips pursed.
You amuse yourself too much with idle gossip, Count. And yet, he murmured, sipping his wine,
you are watching them rather closely for someone who claims not to be concerned.
Florence inhaled slowly, willing herself to remain composed. This could not happen.
Sophie was a girl, not a woman of influence, not someone who should hold a man's gaze for too long. Florence had worked tirelessly to ensure her own place in society, and she would not let a foolish, youthful infatuation disrupt everything.
She smiled at Durant, her expression carefully schooled.
It is my duty to ensure Sophie does not let silly notions get the best of her.
That is all. Durant chuckled.
Of course, Countess. That is all.
But the amusement in his eyes told her he didn't believe her for a second. As the fireworks began to explode in the sky, the Countess Florence felt a pang of bitterness.
The night, so full of light and celebration, seemed to cast a dark shadow over her heart.
The Count's words echoed in her mind, and she found herself seething with jealousy.
She had always been the object of admiration, the one everyone sought, and now Sophie, innocent, beautiful Sophie, was becoming the center of attention.
She could not bear it.
Chapter 4. When Antonio was pulled into conversation with a group of gentlemen, Sophie took the opportunity to make what she liked to call a lap of the room. It gave her time to compose herself, to steady the strange new emotions stirring in her chest. She spotted Josephine in the midst of a small crowd, basking in the attention of a pair of eager young suitors.
Her laughter rang out like bells, her eyes sparkling with delight. Sophie hesitated for a moment before approaching.
Josephine, her voice low but firm as she slipped beside her younger sister. Josephine turned, her grin widening. Oh, Sophie. You missed it. Lord Etelwood has been reciting the most unusual little ditties. He has promised to send me a book of poetry from his personal collection.
Poetry?
Can you imagine? Sophie sighed, glancing at the young lord in question, who was watching Josephine with rapt admiration. She had forgotten how young Josephine could act, caught up in the excitement of flirtation. Gentlemen, she smiled, and pulled her sister gently away. Let's take a turn of the garden, it's a tad warm in here.
She guided her sister towards the door. You should be careful, Sophie murmured.
Men make promises easily, especially when swept up in an evening like this. But promises in our world are currency, whispered debts waiting to be collected.
Josephine rolled her eyes, still beaming. Oh, don't be such an old hen. It's harmless fun.
Besides, she added with a knowing smirk, everyone is far more interested in you and Lord Antonio.
Sophie stiffened. That is nonsense.
Josephine raised a brow, clearly unconvinced. Is it?
You were the only one he danced with. And I saw the way he looked at you.
Sophie opened her mouth to dismiss it, but then, there it was, the undeniable flutter in her chest at the mere mention of his name. Josephine gasped, watching her older sister's reaction. You like him? Lower your voice, Sophie hissed, throwing a quick glance around them.
Her sister giggled. You do? Oh, how romantic. The mysterious Earl from the distant Baltics, drawn from the shadows by none other than my perfect, wonderful sister.
They were outside now, a handful of people stood around enjoying the morning hues. Sophie swatted Josephine's arm.
Stop it.
Josephine only laughed harder.
You cannot fool me. You may act indifferent, but I see it in your eyes.
Sophie exhaled, shaking her head.
It was only a dance or two.
He was shy and uncomfortable, and I simply wanted to make him feel welcome. Josephine smirked. It was 4, albeit with breaks, but in between he danced with no other.
Sophie had no response to that. When the night finally drew to a close, Sophie retired to her room, but sleep did not come easily. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind tangled in the events of the evening.
The fireworks, the laughter, the music, everything had blended together in a whirlwind of enchantment. She could not shake the memory of his touch, the way his fingers had hesitated before settling against hers, as though uncertain, as though unused to such simple closeness. The way his voice, deep yet gentle, had grown more steady as their conversation continued. And, most of all, the way he had looked at her, not just with admiration, but with something else, something that made her fingers tingle.
Had she imagined it? She turned onto her side, pressing her cheek against the cool pillow. This was dangerous. She barely knew him. And yet, a quiet thrill shivered through her at the thought of seeing him again.
Would he seek her out tomorrow, or would he avoid her?
Had this night meant anything at all to him? She closed her eyes, she both longed for and feared the answer.
Josephine stood in the garden, the delicate lace of her gown catching the light of the morning sun as the last of the guests departed and the housekeepers began their quiet work of dismantling the party's remnants. The world was still, the sun low in the sky, casting soft golden beams through the trees. Her heart felt lighter after the lively evening. It was a perfect party, but now, there was only silence. She found a woolen blanket, wrapped in its faded pattern, and settled herself onto a creaky swinging chair beneath the shelter of an ancient oak.
The rhythmic sway of the chair lulled her into a trance-like reverie.
She could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, but something else, caught her ear. A rustling sound, almost imperceptible.
Turning her head, Josephine froze. At the edge of the garden stood a dog.
Its coat was black as night, sleek but worn, and its amber eyes gleamed with a knowing intelligence, as if it had been waiting for her. She blinked, unsure if it was real or just a figment of her early morning imagination.
A dog?
Here?
Hello there, Josephine whispered gently, a smile curling on her lips. The dog tilted its head, studying her for a moment, before it trotted closer.
Her little purse held the remnants of treats from the banqueting table, and she offered a few scraps, feeling the warmth of the gesture.
The dog ate the delicate crunch of crumbs falling onto the grass.
Afterward, it lay at her feet, curling up beneath the swinging chair as though it belonged there. She leaned back into the chair, the slow swing of it creating a gentle rhythm as she watched the dog.
The world around her felt distant now, just the two of them in this secret moment.
For a fleeting second, she imagined that it was always meant to be like this, that the dog had always been there, only now it had found her.
A soft rustling in the distance broke the spell, and Josephine blinked, her thoughts suddenly scattered.
The dog stood up, its ears perked, alert to something she couldn't hear.
Josephine, come inside.
Estelle, her governess's voice called from the doorway, pulling her from the quiet moment. The dog gave her one last, lingering glance before it turned and melted back into the garden's shadows, leaving Josephine alone. Strange, Josephine murmured to herself, but with a smile, she stood and walked back inside, the memory of the dog's gaze lingering in her mind.
Chapter 5. The morning passed in a blur of activity.
Sophie rode out with a small group, the crisp air stirring her hair as they galloped through the vast estate.
Laughter and light conversation filled the ride, yet her thoughts were elsewhere.
She found herself scanning the horizon, hoping to see a familiar dark figure among the various groups they passed.
But Antonio was nowhere to be found.
After returning, she joined the ladies for a leisurely lunch in one of the sunlit parlors. The conversation was lively discussions of gowns, the latest court gossip, and who had danced with whom the previous evening.
Sophie smiled and nodded where appropriate, but her mind remained distracted. She had half expected to catch a glimpse of him passing by, but the opportunity never came.
In the afternoon, she wandered through the castle, stopping here and there to chat with guests. The drawing room was filled with ladies sketching idyllic scenes from the gardens beyond, their hands gliding elegantly over parchment as they laughed and whispered among themselves. "Come, Lady Sophie," Lady Anne called to her, smiling warmly.
"You should join us.
We could use your expert eye.
Sophie chuckled, shaking her head. You flatter me, but I fear my attempts at drawing would be a tragedy. Lady Anne laughed. Nonsense. You have the artist's soul, I can tell.
Sophie only smiled before excusing herself, moving further through the castle. She found another group gathered in the grand hall, engaged in a spirited game of Uno. Nearby, a pair of gentlemen were deep in conversation about the ongoing political matters in the West. In one of the side chambers, a trio of young ladies sat embroidering, chatting softly.
It was a peaceful scene, one she should have found comforting. But a growing restlessness gnawed at her. Where was he? It wasn't as though she had been searching for him, she told herself she hadn't, but surely she should have seen him at least once by now.
As she stepped onto one of the terraces, she spotted a group of men heading toward the lake, their voices carrying in the afternoon air. They were in high spirits, towels slung over shoulders, shirts unbuttoned as they prepared for a swim. One of them, Lord Stanton, a close family friend she had spent many summers playing together as children, saw her and waved.
Good afternoon, my lady. We are off to test the waters. Care to join us?
She smirked.
Hardly, but I do have advice if you wish to make the most of it. A few of the men chuckled, intrigued.
The best diving spot is past the willow trees on the eastern edge, she nodded toward the farthest part of the lake.
There's a ledge beneath the water that gives a perfect drop. Lord Stanton placed a hand over his heart in mock reverence.
My lady, a true guide to adventure. Perhaps next time, you'll lead us yourself.
She laughed, shaking her head.
I shall leave such exploits to you, my lord. As they strode off toward the lake, she let out a small sigh, folding her arms. Still, no sign of him. She should not care. She should let him seek her out.
But she never did as expected and did not care for ancient formalities.
And yet, why did it feel as though something was missing from the day?
The evening's entertainment had been arranged with the finest precision, the assembled nobility seated in expectant rows, their murmured conversations tapering off as the musicians prepared to play. Sophie, seated near the front with the family, felt the weight of the occasion settle upon her shoulders. The grand salon shimmered with candlelight, casting long shadows over the gleaming instruments and the faces of the audience, their expressions poised between polite curiosity and genuine anticipation.
As the first notes were played, Sophie was immediately swept into the music's embrace. The melody wove its way through the air like a whispered confession, delicate yet urgent.
She leaned forward slightly, drawn in, her breath sinking with the rhythm as the piece unfolded. The violins soared, the pianoforte murmured beneath them, and Sophie's heart swelled with every measure.
She had always loved music, but here, in this moment, it felt different. More consuming. More alive.
As she listened, a strange awareness settled over her, like the faintest pressure of a gaze upon her skin. She dismissed it at first, too enthralled by the performance to spare a thought for anything else. But when the final notes faded into silence, replaced by a hushed stillness, she turned her head slightly, almost instinctively.
He was watching her. Not the musicians, not the performance, but her. Her pulse quickened as the realization took hold. Had he watched her throughout? Had he seen the way the music had moved her, the way she had been carried away by it?
His expression was unreadable, but in his dark eyes, there was something she could not deny, something intense, something unspoken. For a fleeting, shimmering moment, the room, the applause, and the noble audience, all of it faded into the periphery. It was just the two of them, locked in a silent exchange, a connection formed in the space between breath and heartbeat.
And Sophie, caught in the lingering spell of the music, was powerless to look away.
The dining hall was a spectacle of wealth and refinement, its vaulted ceiling adorned with glistening chandeliers, casting a warm golden light over the long, lavishly set table. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine lingered in the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation and the occasional chime of silver against porcelain. Sophie, seated near the middle of the table, found herself opposite Antonio but too far to speak to him directly. Instead, she was trapped beside Lord Henri Harbour, a man whose presence was as overbearing as his voice. Ah, but of course, this house, charming in its way, I suppose, does not compare to Blackwood Manor, he declared, waving a hand as though sweeping the entire room into irrelevance. Now, that is a true estate that wasn't affected by the war. Grand halls, sweeping staircases, and the most exquisite dining arrangements. Why, at Lord Ashbourne's supper last month, the courses were served with such precision, not a single dish out of place.
Unlike here, where I dare say the venison was rather overcooked.
Sophie's fingers clenched around the stem of her wine glass, though she forced a smile. I'm sure the Lord's household is most impressive.
But I do hope you find something here to your liking, Lord Harbour. He chuckled.
A loud, brash sound that grated against her ears. Oh, my dear, you misunderstand me.
I've no complaints about the company, only the execution. He gestured broadly at the table. The silver is well polished, I grant you.
And the wine, passable, though hardly remarkable.
Sophie's grip on her glass tightened. This was her home.
He was a guest at her family's table, and yet he spoke as though he were offering some benevolent critique of a subpar theatre performance. She had tried, truly, to steer the conversation elsewhere, to engage in polite discussion, but Lord Harbour's voice bulldozed over any attempt she made to speak. Of course, I have attended finer affairs, he continued, swirling his wine as if to prove his point. The dinner at Lord Pembroke's estate, now, that was an evening.
A menu planned months in advance, exotic delicacies brought in from across the continent. Nothing like this. He gestured dismissively at his plate, shaking his head. A shame, really. Sophie's lips pressed together, her patience wearing thin.
Insult after insult, he spoke without a second thought, as though she were not sitting right beside him, as though this house, her family's home, were nothing more than an amusing stop along his journey of self-importance. Well, she thought, good old Lord Pembroke's estate may be rich and wonderful, but there was a reason why some were left alone and others crumbled, and there was nothing admirable about that. She glanced up, feeling that same weight from before, that awareness of being watched across the table. Antonio was looking at her not with pity, nor amusement, but something else.
Understanding.
For a brief moment, Sophie felt as though she had an ally, and somehow, that made all the difference.
The evening stretched on in a blur of polite smiles and endless distractions.
Every time Sophie found herself with a moment to breathe, someone was there, pulling her in another direction. Come, Sophie, you must join us for a game of cards, Lady Evelyn insisted, linking arms with her before she could protest.
No sooner had she excused herself from that than her stepmother appeared at her side. Sophie, be a dear and fetch your father's spectacles. He must have left them in the library. Barely 5 minutes later, another summons.
Sophie, your father was looking for you. Oh, no need now, I found him. But could you see if the housekeepers have cleared the east parlor?
It was endless.
A series of small, inconsequential tasks, each one dragging her further away from the one person she wanted to speak to.
And whether it was deliberate or merely coincidence, by the end of the night, she was utterly drained.
The last guests were departing, the grand hall growing quieter as coats were retrieved and final pleasantries exchanged. Sophie exhaled, relieved to be retreating at last, when she turned the corner and... oh!
She collided softly with a tall, solid frame. Her hands reached out instinctively, steadying herself before she could stumble.
Forgive me,
came a familiar voice, warm with amusement.
She looked up.
Antonio.
A flicker of surprise crossed his face, as though he hadn't expected to find her here, and yet, something in his expression suggested he was not displeased by it.
You are well?
He asked. Sophie opened her mouth, but for a moment, no words came. Her heart was racing, her mind inexplicably blank.
After a night of being pulled in every direction, of stolen glances and missed opportunities, she was finally face to face with him, and now, she had no idea what to say. Instead, Sophie's gaze dropped to her hands, now awkwardly raised and pressed against the firm wall of his chest, a startling realization that sent heat rushing to her face.
Panic flickered through her as she jerked them away, mortified by the unintended contact. Her thoughts tangled into a frantic jumble, one tripping over the next.
He was waiting for her to speak, his expression patient yet unreadable.
But what could she possibly say?
Her pulse quickened as she struggled to find words, the weight of expectation pressing heavily on her chest.
But nothing coherent came.
Only the persistent awareness of his steady presence, close enough to unravel her carefully maintained composure. Finally, she forced herself to smile, hoping it masked her hesitation.
Yes. A wonderful recital.
Indeed, he said, studying her as though considering his next words.
Will you be accompanying your father next month to Lord Freem's reception?
She hesitated. I'm not sure. He hardly takes me to such things.
Antonio tilted his head slightly, as if that answer intrigued him, but before he could respond, a voice called his name from across the hall. She wanted to step back, realizing how close they were. What would the man watching them think?
But she couldn't move.
Antonio's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, then he inclined his head.
Then I hope to see you again, regardless.
And with that, he was gone.
Sophie stood frozen, the space he had occupied now feeling strangely empty. The evening's exhaustion pressed down on her, yet beneath it, something restless and unshaken remained.
It was as if his presence had altered her, left an imprint she couldn't quite name. No matter where he had been tonight, across the room, at the far end of the table, or simply a fleeting figure in the candlelit corridors, she had been aware of him. Keenly. Unreasonably. Her thoughts swirled, tangled in the echoes of the evening.
Every glance, every smile, every lingering note of the music played back in her mind like a melody she couldn't forget.
She had felt everything tonight, the ache of longing, the vulnerability of being truly seen. And now, standing alone in the dimly lit hall, she realized she was happy. A rare, unfamiliar happiness, delicate yet thrilling in its intensity. But as the staff moved through the house, dimming the chandeliers and snuffing out the last candles, shadows crept into her mind. Doubt whispered at the edges of her contentment. What had this night truly meant? Had it been anything at all? Chapter 6.
The morning sunlight filtered through the high windows of the breakfast hall, casting a golden glow across the long mahogany table. Outside, the wind carried the distant hum of the farmer's machinery from the outer fields. Inside, the scent of fresh bread, honey, and spiced tea filled the air, mingling with the crisp coolness of the early day.
Sophie and Josephine entered together, their footsteps soft against the polished wooden floor, one of the few surfaces still meticulously maintained in a world that had long abandoned luxury.
Josephine, still radiant with excitement from the previous evening, hummed a tune under her breath, a soft melody that mirrored the lingering joy she carried from the ball. Sophie, however, was subdued, her thoughts entangled in the events of the previous nights, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against her chest.
Their father, the Earl of Kimberley, sat at the head of the table.
His expression remained unreadable as he thumbed through a weathered ledger, its cracked binding and faded ink a reminder that paper itself had become a rare commodity. Countess Florence was already seated beside him, her every movement precise and deliberate, as she stirred a single spoonful of sugar into her tea.
Across from her sat Philippe, their younger brother, his eyes still heavy with sleep, as he absent-mindedly pushed his fork through a plate of eggs.
As Sophie and Josephine took their seats, Florence offered them a smile, practiced, polished, but utterly devoid of warmth. A wonderful evening, was it not?
Josephine, ever eager, nodded enthusiastically. Oh, it was splendid. The music, the gowns, the conversation, it was like something out of a dream. Florence tilted her head slightly, her expression measured. Our guests were most impressed by the company. Though, of course, there were certain moments of interest.
Sophie recognized the calculated lilt in her stepmother's voice.
She did not have to ask what moments Florence was referring to.
The Earl, without lifting his gaze from the page, grunted his approval. A necessary affair. It's good for people to see that the Kimberley estate remains as influential as ever.
His words were more than social posturing. Influence was survival.
With resources dwindling, alliances had become as crucial as oxygen. Without them, families crumbled, and estates fell into ruin, swallowed by the wastelands that had claimed so many others. Josephine paid no heed to their father's formality and continued, her voice bright with enthusiasm. Did you see the way Lord Atelwood recited poetry?
Utterly charming. He promised to send me a book from his personal collection.
Philippe scoffed, finally lifting his head from his plate. Poetry?
He must be desperate for conversation. Josephine swatted at him playfully. You wouldn't understand, Philippe. A well-versed man is far more interesting than one who merely talks about horses and trade. A well-versed man is still a man, Philippe muttered, returning to his food.
Florence set her teacup down delicately, her gaze, sharp as glass, shifted toward Sophie.
Speaking of interesting gentlemen. Lady Sophie, you spent quite some time dancing last night.
Tell me, what did you think of Lord Antonio Angoulême? Sophie felt every set of eyes at the table turn toward her.
She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. He was a gracious partner. Florence's smile did not reach her eyes. Yes. Gracious indeed. Some would say reserved, even withdrawn. One wonders why such a man would suddenly appear at court after all this time.
The Earl finally set down his book and fixed Sophie with a look that made her shoulders stiffen.
The Angoulême estate is not one I've had much cause to deal with. A secluded family.
Their wealth is old, but their presence among our circles is
new.
Sophie forced herself to take a slow sip of tea, hoping to mask the way her stomach twisted into knots. The Angoulême name carried whispers with it, of secrets buried deep, of a family that had survived in the shadows while others fell. Florence, watching Sophie closely, shifted the conversation with a graceful turn. I must say that Lord Henri Harbour was most eager for your company, Sophie.
A very respectable man, from an impeccable family.
Sophie tightened her grip on her teacup.
I recall. He was quite vocal about his opinions on last night's dining arrangements.
Philippe snorted, and Josephine let out a poorly concealed giggle, both remembering Lord Henri's overly loud critiques of the food, company, and everything else, nothing meeting his high expectations.
Florence's lips pressed into a thin line. Regardless, he is a man of good standing. He has expressed interest in calling upon you.
The Earl, seemingly satisfied with the prospect, nodded.
Henri comes from a line of stability. A practical match.
The words chilled Sophie more than the draft slipping through the cracked mortar of the castle walls. Practical.
As if marriage were nothing more than another transaction, as if her own feelings held no weight at all. No, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Silence fell over the table. The Earl's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening ever so slightly.
No?
His voice carried the quiet authority of a man unaccustomed to defiance.
Sophie forced herself to meet his gaze, though her pulse pounded in her ears.
I will not be bartered like a piece of land.
You are being short-sighted.
He folded his arms across his chest.
Stability ensures survival, Sophie.
Your whims do not.
And what of happiness? Sophie challenged. Florence sighed, dabbing at the corner of her lips with a linen napkin. You speak as if you live in a world where happiness is guaranteed. The remaining moments of breakfast were filled with the faint clink of silverware against porcelain, the slow, deliberate scrape of a knife spreading butter, and the occasional soft clink of a teacup being set down. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, its embers shifting with quiet pops, but no one spoke. The rhythmic ticking of the old brass clock on the mantelpiece filled the void, each measured second stretching the silence further. As breakfast concluded and the family began to rise, Josephine linked her arm through Sophie's, whispering as they stepped away from the table.
You're thinking about him, aren't you? Sophie sighed. Don't be ridiculous.
Josephine smirked.
You are. I see it. She gave a playful nudge. Don't worry, dear sister. If you won't fight for him, I certainly will. Chapter 7.
The late morning was crisp, the cool air tinged with dew and the faint scent of wildflowers, echoing the magic of the night before. Sophie, light-hearted and brimming with anticipation, joined the others as they prepared for the ride. The soft clatter of horse hooves, the rustle of fabric, and the cheerful chorus of laughter and chatter filled the air.
Yet as she scanned the group beneath the pale light of dawn, her excitement faltered. Antonio was nowhere to be seen.
An unexpected ache settled in her chest, as if a cool wind had swept through her heart, dulling the joy of the impending ride. As the group waited beneath the shade of an ancient oak, laughter and conversation filled the air. A nearby voice broke through, "Where has the dashing Antonio gone?"
I expected to see him riding with us today. A lady, her tone tinged with resignation, sighed softly. He sailed for Naples this morning. He's gone.
The words struck Sophie like a sudden gust of winter air, stealing the warmth from her chest.
Her stomach clenched painfully, and for a moment, the world tilted ever so slightly. Gone?
The word echoed in her mind, hollow and heavy, each syllable resonating like a tolling bell.
She hadn't expected this, not so soon, not without warning. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came.
A strange numbness settled over her, masking the tangle of emotions twisting inside: disbelief,
disappointment, and something dangerously close to longing.
Before she could gather herself, the lady, who she now realized was her friend Clara, turned to her, one brow arched in quiet curiosity.
Her voice dropped into a low, conspiratorial tone. "You spent quite some time with him at the ball, Sophie.
Tell me, had I been mistaken?"
It certainly seemed like he was paying you particular attention.
Sophie's pulse quickened, heat rising to her face despite the cold ache in her chest. Memories from the previous night flickered through her mind, her hands on his chest, his questioning her appearance at the next ball. Those eyes watching her without giving away his thoughts. Sophie faltered, struggling to find a response that would satisfy Clara's curiosity without betraying the truth swirling inside her. Clara's lips curved into a small, amused smile.
"Ah. So I wasn't mistaken." "It wasn't like that," Sophie insisted, though her voice wavered.
Clara tilted her head thoughtfully, a mischievous glint in her eyes.
"If you say so." But Sophie barely registered her friend's words.
The weight of his departure pressed heavily on her chest, and though the ambient sound of laughter and conversation enveloped the group like a soft blanket, a strange, isolating silence closed in around her.
He was gone.
And though she had never dared to hope for anything beyond fleeting moments of connection, she couldn't ignore the ache blooming in the hollow space where possibility had once lingered. Sophie turned her gaze to the rolling hills ahead, a gentle breeze against her skin.
She had let herself believe it, just for a moment, that there had been a connection between them. But morning had come, and he was gone. The truth settled cold in her chest. She had been foolish to think otherwise. What had she expected?
That he would stay, sweep her into his arms, and carry her away from all this? Shaking off the fleeting fantasy, she acknowledged the stark reality: he had left, and she remained exactly where she had always been.
Had she been just a distraction, a little flirtation while he was away from home? Doubt crept in, insidious and relentless.
Perhaps she had read too much into fleeting glances and half-spoken words. This was a new path she had never traveled before. Perhaps he had merely been biding his time until duty, or something more interesting, called him away. But there was one consolation, that, despite her misplaced hopes, she had never acted on her emotions. She could still carry with her the knowledge that her conduct had always been guided by propriety, and she hadn't made a fool of herself.
"This may not be the best time, but I have news." This pulled Sophie from her thoughts.
She glanced at Clara, who tipped her head toward the trees, a silent signal.
They let the others drift ahead until their voices faded into murmurs on the wind. When they were far enough away, Sophie arched a brow. "Now you've ensured I must hear it. What is it?"
Clara hesitated, as though holding the words back would somehow keep them from being true.
Then, she leaned in slightly.
"Lady Lucy Preston is to be wed." "Lucy?"
The name came out in a whisper, her shock evident.
"But, to whom?"
Clara's expression turned uneasy. "The Earl of Whitmore."
The breath left Sophie's lungs in a rush. "Whitmore?
But
she's never even mentioned him before."
Her words were too loud. They both instinctively glanced at the group. No one was paying them any mind.
Because she had no reason to, Clara grimaced. The arrangement was made by her father.
She was told only last night. A sick feeling settled in Sophie's stomach.
Lucy, her sweet and spirited friend, promised to a man she did not choose. It was becoming a cruel script, one the ladies saw more often these days. It played out again and again in quiet parlors and candlelit studies, where fathers and lords struck bargains with their daughters' futures as if they were commodities to be traded.
Sophie swallowed hard. And does she? She hesitated, already knowing the answer. Does she love him? Clara gave a short, bitter laugh.
Love?
Sophie, she barely knows the man.
She met him once at a winter gathering last year, and she said he spoke more to his hounds than to her. Clara glanced at Sophie then, her expression shadowed with something unspoken.
But it does not matter, does it?
Love is hardly the deciding factor in these matters.
Sophie's jaw clenched.
No, her voice tight.
It should be the only factor. Clara sighed, adjusting her bonnet.
You know as well as I do that nowadays we don't have that luxury.
Marriages are about alliances, wealth, stability. What we want, what we feel, is no longer of consequence. Sophie's hands trembled slightly. It is of consequence to me.
Clara turned to her, brows raised. Sophie.
No, Sophie interrupted, her voice firmer now. I will not be bartered off like a debt to be settled. I will not wake up one morning to learn my future has been decided without me.
Her pulse pounded in her ears, the words tumbling from her lips before she could stop them. If I marry, it will be because I have chosen it.
Because I love him. And if that is not possible, then I will not marry at all. Her mind flickered to Antonio, but she shoved the thought aside.
Clara let out a slow breath, searching her face.
You truly mean that, don't you? I do.
Sophie's gaze was unwavering, her decision no longer just a fleeting thought but a declaration, a promise to herself. Clara shook her head, though there was admiration in her eyes. Then heaven help the man who dares try and claim you, Sophie Kimberly. Sophie turned her face toward the horizon, her heart still racing.
Let them try. She would never be caged by expectation. Not now. Not ever.
The evening filled with music, laughter, and the unspoken weight of farewells. It all led to the dawning, a tradition where the guests gathered by the lake to watch the sunrise, marking the transition from one world to the next. It was symbolic, a reenactment of the night before the final ships had left, carrying those who chose the stars over the soil, while those who remained rebuilt from the ashes. As the first light broke over the horizon, everyone released glowing lanterns, each carrying a golden coin. The finder could keep and use it. After all, there was only one currency now, a single world bound by simplicity. Sophie watched the lanterns rise, their golden glow fading into the morning sky, just like the hope she briefly held.
But as the light drifted away, so did the illusion. For those few hours she had felt full of life, but now the world seemed dull.
Dawn arrived, but instead of a fresh start, all she felt was the quiet ache of what could have been. After a while, the laughter and conversation blurred into the background, and Sophie felt the need to slip away for a moment of solitude. She moved toward the edge of the glowing pathways, stepping beneath the shadow of an ancient oak. The cool night air wrapped around her, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the celebration. A gentle rustle of fabric and the soft creak of worn leather shoes signaled the approach of Estelle. The older woman moved with a grace that belied her years, her presence as comforting as the scent of lavender that clung to her shawl.
Her silver-streaked hair was neatly pinned up into a high bun, and her brilliant chocolate brown eyes, wise and warm, held the quiet strength of someone who had witnessed much and endured more.
She folded her arms, regarding Sophie with a knowing look.
You look lost in thought, my dear.
Sophie turned, managing a small, weary smile.
Just thinking. The night is beautiful, isn't it?
Estelle nodded, arching an eyebrow.
Or perhaps your thoughts are elsewhere?
A certain young Earl, perhaps? A faint flush rose in Sophie's cheeks as she exhaled a quiet laugh, tinged with vulnerability.
Am I that obvious?
To me?
Always, Estelle chuckled softly. Your face gives you away. You hold yourself like someone waiting for something, or someone. For a moment, Sophie hesitated before her voice dropped to a near whisper. I don't know what to think.
I barely know him, yet he lingers in my mind as though I do.
And now he's gone. Her tone turned wistful, heavy with regret. I should not have allowed myself to hope.
Estelle's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder.
Hope is not a weakness. It is what keeps us moving forward. Sophie sighed, glancing toward the fading lanterns. I overheard an older couple talking at the ball.
About the great departure.
About what life used to be like before the war changed everything. Estelle's expression shifted, her gaze turning distant.
It's not spoken of much anymore, not outside whispers and private conversations.
But yes, before the departure, the world was different. More advanced, they say. More complicated. And now we live by tradition, Sophie murmured, glancing back at the festivities. The old world was abandoned, its relics were left behind. We've built this new order, as if the past never happened. Sophie had always wondered, what would she have done?
If given the choice, would she have left?
Or would she have stayed behind, clinging to a world in ruin? Estelle's voice softened. That's how it had to be.
The ones who left, the ones who took to the stars, made their choice.
And those who remained had to build a life out of what was left.
The Earls now rule, guiding what remains of civilization, keeping the balance between tradition and survival.
Sophie turned to her, searching her face. But do you think they chose right? That staying behind was the better path?
For a long, measured moment, Estelle's face remained unreadable.
Then, with a gentle sigh, she finally said, "Some would say the ones who left were the wise ones.
Others would say they were cowards, abandoning a broken world instead of fixing it.
But does it matter now? We are here, and we must make the best of what we have." Sophie nodded slowly, though her mind still whirled with questions.
And the shipments?
The medicines from the colonies beyond?
We still rely on them, don't we?
A necessary agreement, Estelle admitted softly. A way to keep those who remained from perishing altogether. But we are expected to fend for ourselves in every other way. She reached out, gently tucking a stray strand of Sophie's hair behind her ear. "You've always been curious, Sophie. But be careful with questions like these. Some do not take kindly to them."
Sophie met Estelle's steady gaze, absorbing the quiet warning behind it.
"I understand."
Estelle smiled faintly, then turned toward the woods, watching the guests move through the glowing pathways, their laughter carrying on the wind.
"Your sister has no such concerns. She embraces life as it comes." A quiet laugh escaped Sophie. "She believes in magic and adventure. She sees only possibility. Perhaps you should let yourself see a little of that too," Estelle suggested gently. "Just for tonight."
Chapter 8. The Earl stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of brandy in hand, watching his daughters among the gathered guests. The flickering candlelight illuminated their faces, catching the shimmer of their gowns as they moved through the crowd. Yet, it was Sophie who drew his attention most.
Something about her demeanor unsettled him.
She smiled and nodded when spoken to, but there was a distance in her eyes, an absence he couldn't quite place.
His wife, Countess Florence, stepped beside him, her sharp gaze following his. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly, brushing an invisible speck from her gown. The Earl exhaled slowly.
Sophie looks distracted.
Florence's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you haven't heard." He turned to her with a frown.
"Heard what?"
"A certain
attraction," her eyes flickering towards Sophie before lowering her voice.
"Lord Antonio."
The Earl scoffed.
"Antonio? I don't listen to idle gossip."
"It isn't gossip," Florence replied, smoothing a hand over her skirts.
"They spent too much time together. People noticed. But you needn't trouble yourself with it."
"It's been handled, my dear. He left for Naples this morning."
Whatever foolishness she allowed herself to believe has already come to an end. The Earl took another sip of brandy, his expression unreadable.
"Then it's settled."
"Not quite," Florence's voice laced with suggestion. "It's time she marries."
He turned to her, raising an eyebrow.
"She's young yet."
"Young, but not too young," Florence countered smoothly.
"Lord Henri would make an excellent match." The Earl frowned, swirling the amber liquid in his glass.
"Henri is a bore."
"Henri is well connected," Florence corrected, her tone measured. "He comes from an impeccable family, and Sophie would want for nothing."
"You know how these things are done, my dear."
"Sentiment has no place in matters of marriage."
The Earl considered this, his gaze drifting back to Sophie, who stood by a window, staring into the night.
Whatever sadness gripped her, he would not entertain it. He had never been one to indulge his children's emotions.
"I will consider it,"
he said finally. Florence smiled, victorious. "On the subject, the girls are too old to remain in the nursery quarters. It's time they moved to proper suites. Their governess should return to the staff quarters where she belongs." The Earl nodded.
"Arrange it."
The festivities had ended, and the last of the guests had departed, leaving the estate quiet and still.
Josephine, feeling a rare moment of peace before the whirlwind of change that her father's plans would surely bring, slipped away from the house.
She had been told of the move of quarters and had begged her father at lunch to reconsider it, but he was unmoving, so she avoided the gossiping staff and found freedom outside.
She found him again, the black dog, sitting beneath a thick hedge near the solar farm, the silent workhorse that powered the castle's fragile opulence.
She sat and enjoyed the late afternoon in peace.
The dog lay calmly beside her, his amber eyes tracking the men who were lazily plowing the fields.
He was no wild dog.
He always appeared from the shadows when she needed him most, just as though he had been waiting for her for this moment. During the past few days, when the estate was bustling with activity, Josephine had found herself wandering away, her footsteps light and carefree. Each time she slipped outside, the dog seemed to inch closer, his presence like a quiet echo to her own. It was as if he, too, was a part of this estate. Sitting on the grass beside him, Josephine began to speak, her words floating in the air like fragments of her thoughts.
She confided in him, as though he were an old friend, her trusted companion in the peaceful silence after the eventful night.
The dog listened intently, his amber gaze never straying from her face, as though he understood every word. Perhaps, Josephine mused aloud, you were once a noble hound, guarding a castle from invaders, protecting your king.
Or maybe you were a prince, under a spell, and I am the only one who can break it. Her voice was soft, her eyes bright with innocent wonder.
The dog didn't react, only continued to watch her, as though he was silently approving of her fanciful tale.
There was no judgment in his eyes, no hint of impatience.
He was simply there, present, listening.
Are you really a prince?
She asked, her gaze fixed on him, her face full of youthful curiosity. The dog tilted his head, his amber eyes intently watching her. He never wandered far, always within reach, but never too close, as though he were an enigma she hadn't yet solved.
She smiled softly to herself, enjoying the brief moment of companionship.
For now, she could hold on to the simplicity of the dog's company, and perhaps even the stories she created for him. The air hung heavy with dust, swirling in the flickering candlelight in their new rooms. The scent of aged wood and long-forgotten fabric settled over them like a shroud. The furniture, though grand, bore the weight of years untouched, and the drapes hung heavy and unyielding, blocking out most of the moonlight. Sophie traced the cool marble of the fireplace in her bedroom, a shiver ghosting down her spine.
It feels different, she murmured. Her younger sister shifted uncomfortably. These rooms have been empty for years. But why?
Why would no one use them?
Her mouth pulled down in a small frown.
Estelle, ever the optimist, strode to the windows and pulled the heavy curtains open.
Dust swirled in the air as the light came in.
She sighed, muttering about clearing the dust and letting fresh air in.
It'll feel better once it's been properly aired out.
Later, in the glow of a single candle, Sophie confided her unease to Estelle.
Something doesn't feel right about this place, she admitted.
I don't know what it is, but she hesitated, lowering her voice.
I feel watched. Estelle, always the rational one, gave a soft laugh, but it faltered at the edges. You're being ridiculous, Sophie. It's just a different part of the castle, nothing more. But the weight of the room pressed against her, and the feeling of unseen eyes never quite faded.
She turned slightly, adjusting the folds of her dress, before settling onto the edge of Sophie's bed. This is how it should be, she continued, her voice gentler now, you're growing up.
You should have moved out of the nursery long ago.
Sophie lowered her gaze, tracing an invisible pattern on the embroidered quilt.
I suppose, she murmured, but the unease in her chest refused to fade. Estelle reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly. I know it feels strange, but change always does at first.
In a few weeks, with a good freshening up, this will feel like home, and we'll wonder why we ever hesitated. Sophie nodded, but something about the darkened corners of the room, the way the heavy drapes seemed to shift without a breeze, made her doubt it.
You're letting shadows play tricks on you. Yet, as she turned away, Sophie caught the way Estelle's hands trembled slightly.
She began rummaging through the cabinets.
Sophie's attention was captured by a miniature photograph, set into a locket, she found hidden beneath a blanket.
The beautiful lady, her dress unmistakably of the old world, sat still looking into the camera. But it was her eyes that stopped Sophie, grief. She couldn't understand why this word came to mind, but as she looked into this woman's still expression, tears began rolling down her face.
Sophie traced the delicate strokes of the miniature painting with her fingers, her heart pounding.
The woman in the portrait, with her soft eyes and gentle smile, seemed almost familiar, though Sophie knew she had never met her.
Estelle, Sophie pressed, gripping the frame.
Who is she?
Estelle hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. A flicker of sorrow crossed her face as she looked down at the locket.
"That," she finally said, her voice laced with emotion, "is your mother, Lady Louise de Montfort." The weight of those words settled over Sophie like a heavy cloak. A woman she had fleeting memories of, yet whose absence had shaped her entire existence. Beside her, Josephine leaned in, eyes wide with wonder and grief. "Tell us about her," she urged.
"Please."
A deep sigh escaped Estelle as she settled into a chair, folding her hands in her lap. "It's not an easy story to tell," she admitted, staring at the portrait as if it held 1,000 memories.
"But you deserve to know." She took a breath, gathering herself, and then began. "Your mother was Lady Louise de Montfort, the only daughter of Lord Marquis de Montfort. Her family came from the southern regions of France, where they lived in prosperity, until a sudden plague swept through the land. Within weeks, her mother and 3 younger brothers were gone, leaving only Louise and her father." Sophie shifted as a shiver ran down her spine. She had never known this part of their history, never realized how much loss had already been woven into their lineage before she was even born. The Lord was devastated.
He retreated to a modest estate, taking Louise with him, hoping to find peace in isolation.
But grief is a cruel thing, it leaves a person hollow.
Estelle's gaze flickered toward the window, momentarily lost in her own thoughts.
"That was where they met Chastine," she continued. "She was no noblewoman, just a local lady who had suffered her own tragedy. She had lost her husband and children, save for one son, Devon. Grief made quick companions of them all.
Louise and Devon, close in age, grew up together, their lessons shared, their lives intertwined."
"Did she love him?"
Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
Estelle nodded slowly. "She did. But it took her time to understand it.
To everyone else, they were simply children growing up side by side, bound by circumstance. But Chastine saw the way they looked at each other.
How Louise was always different when Devon was near, how she lingered when he read poetry aloud, how she softened when he spoke to her.
And so, when the Count decided that Devon must leave for boarding school, it was like tearing the very foundation from beneath them.
A lump formed in Sophie's throat. "What did she do?" "She said nothing," Estelle murmured.
She turned to her piano instead, as if music could shield her from the ache of his absence. But on the night before his departure, Devon gave her his most beloved dog, asking her to care for it, so that, in some way, he would still be with her.
Josephine sighed. "That's so romantic." Estelle gave a sad smile. "Perhaps. But love, when it cannot be spoken, becomes a quiet torment."
Every time Devon returned from his studies, they were drawn to each other again, only for him to leave once more.
And then, on his final visit, he did what everyone had expected all along, he asked for her hand in marriage. Sophie's breath caught.
"And?"
"There was joy," Estelle said for a moment, "there was pure, untainted happiness. They celebrated."
Everyone thought their story would have a happy ending, but the next morning, he left, and was never seen alive again.
A cold silence filled the room. Estelle looked towards the window and continued. "Once, love had mattered more than position.
It wasn't unusual for an earl's daughter to marry a farmer, to trade silks for wool, and take on the role of a wife in a modest home with happiness, without shame. There was an unspoken understanding that love was worth more than bloodlines," she sighed. "Over the past few years, though, something has shifted. The old ways, the rigid rules that everyone had once agreed were wrong, have crept back into society like ivy reclaiming a crumbling ruin.
Marriages became transactions again, love a mere indulgence for those who could afford it." Estelle pressed her lips together, chiding herself. This was not a story for the girls. It was wrong to make them think too much about what had been lost. They needed to believe in happy endings. "What happened?" Josephine finally asked. "No one knows," Estelle replied. "He was found dead."
Louise never spoke of what she believed happened, but she was never the same again.
Neither was her father. Already broken by grief, shut himself away once more.
Chastine tried to help, but nothing could reach him.
And that was when the Earl of Kimberley came into the picture. Sophie stiffened at the mention of her father.
"He was persistent," Estelle continued, her voice turning measured. "Louise explained her grief, refused him, over and over, but he would not give up. Your grandfather, seeing her reluctance, did not force her, but his own health had begun to fail.
And when he finally passed. She paused, watching as Sophie and Josephine leaned in, waiting. The Count had never updated his will. His entire estate, his title, his wealth, it all passed to his younger brother, a man Louise had never met. He had no interest in caring for her, and so she was left with nothing.
No home, no security. Just Chastine by her side.
Sophie swallowed.
She had no choice.
Estelle nodded. No, she married your father out of necessity, not love.
He took her to England, to a land unfamiliar, to a language she barely spoke.
Her only comfort was that Chastine was allowed to come with her, but even then, she had to be disguised as nothing more than a maid. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to suppress the sadness that still lingered. They had a few years together. You three were born. And then, an accident took both your mother and Chastine from this world. Sophie clutched the miniature to her chest, her heart aching.
She had spent her entire life knowing so little of the woman who had brought her into the world now. She knew the tragedy that had shaped her, but it only left her with more sorrow.
She had been loved, once.
Truly, deeply loved.
And in the end, she had lost everything. Sophie turned to Estelle, her voice raw.
Do you think she was ever happy here? Estelle hesitated, then gave a small, bittersweet smile.
She found joy where she could. She had you and she had Chastine.
And sometimes, I think.
She found happiness in her memories. Even if they were only ghosts.
Sophie closed her eyes, letting the weight of the story settle over her.
Josephine's voice trembled. But what about Florence? I don't remember her not being in our lives. Estelle's expression darkened.
When the Earl returned from a trip to find his wife and Chastine dead and his daughters without a mother, he wasted no time. He remarried quickly, to a beautiful woman named Florence van der Hume.
He entrusted the care of his children to her. And well, here we are. A heavy silence filled the room.
Sophie looked down at the miniature, her vision blurred with tears.
She was beautiful. She was, Estelle whispered. And she loved you both more than anything. Chapter 9.
The grand festivities had come to an end, and the Earl and Countess, ever preoccupied with their social standing, had already turned their attention to the next great event. They busied themselves with preparations for their journey, barely noticing their daughters, who were once again left to their own devices. Each morning, as dawn's first light touched the castle's spires, the sisters rode out across the countryside. The cool air carried the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, and for those precious hours, they felt untethered from the weight of expectation. On the third morning, the sisters pressed on further than usual, riding for miles until they reached the fringes of a neighboring village and the eerie ruins of an old airfield.
Sophie urged her mare forward, her breath catching as she took in the crumbling remains. He had been here many times before, but it still unnerved her. The idea of being in the sky in metal tubes didn't sit right. How had the people gathered enough strength to do this without fainting from fear of falling out of the sky?
The scent of rust and decaying stone mingled with the crisp morning air, and her heart faltered at the sight. Outside what must have once been a bustling lounge for weary travelers, Antonio sat as if he belonged among the relics of a forgotten era. He lounged casually on a weathered bench, as though expecting a waitress to appear with a tray of refreshments.
His posture was relaxed yet watchful.
He had only been gone a little time since they had met and danced, yet it felt like a lifetime.
Sophie pulled her horse to a sudden stop, her breath momentarily stolen.
Antonio was watching her, his dark eyes shone with something unreadable. Nearby, Josephine, ever perceptive, cast Sophie a knowing glance. Without a word, she guided her own mount back toward a copse of trees, positioning herself at a discreet distance where she could keep a careful watch.
For just a moment, Sophie hesitated before dismounting.
The damp grass, cool beneath her riding boots, sent a shiver up her legs as she stepped toward him.
Her pulse quickened with every measured step. "My lord," she began, though her voice cracked.
"Please, call me Antonio,"
he urged, his voice warm and smooth like silk, wrapping around her like a whispered secret. She hesitated, testing the name on her tongue. Antonio. It felt right, grounding somehow, and a small smile tugged at her lips.
"I didn't think I'd see you again, she admitted softly, the words barely audible. His faint smile flickered.
I had no choice,
he said quietly.
They sent me away.
Sophie frowned as the words sank in who. He hesitated.
Your mother,
he answered,
on instruction of your father.
The words struck her like a sudden blow, as sharp as the cold morning air.
Though she had suspected as much. Her father was not a man to tolerate distractions, especially where his daughters were concerned. Then why are you here? She asked.
Because I couldn't stay away.
His voice was quiet.
I am embarrassed to admit, but I have thought of you every day.
A brief warmth spread through Sophie's chest, quickly shadowed by the weight of reality.
He looked nervous.
I needed to know, was I wrong to come here?
I'm glad you came back, Sophie's voice quieter than she intended. Heat rushed to her cheeks, blooming into a deep flush that she couldn't hide.
But how did you know to meet me here?
Antonio's lips curved into a knowing smile. He shifted his gaze meaningfully toward Josephine, who stood a few yards away, clearly within sight but just out of earshot. She was crouched near the edge of the cracked tarmac, plucking wildflowers with exaggerated interest as though she hadn't orchestrated the entire meeting.
Sophie blinked in surprise.
Josephine?
He chuckled, the sound rich and warm.
Your sister is quite persuasive. She wrote to me a rather spirited letter, I might add.
His tone turned mock serious.
She informed me that my disappearance was exceptionally rude, that you were sad beyond reason, and that if I had any shred of honor, I would return immediately to explain myself.
Sophie's eyes widened. She didn't.
Oh, she did.
He grinned.
I had no choice.
Despite herself, Sophie laughed, a light, melodic sound that mingled with the rustling leaves, and for a moment, the tension eased as she imagined Josephine's petulant scrawl and fierce determination.
She really is impossible sometimes. Antonio's gaze softened.
In the best way, though.
She took the seat next to him, the worn bench cool beneath her.
At first, their words were cautious, like the tentative steps of strangers unsure of the ground beneath them. But gradually, conversation flowed, easy, unhurried, and laughter bubbled between them as Antonio recounted Josephine's playful scoldings, while Sophie shook her head in affectionate disbelief. As the afternoon stretched on, their words deepened, touching on dreams and uncertainties. The light shifted, painting the ruins in hues of gold and amber, but neither seemed to notice. Antonio, what happened to your family?
Sophie asked in a moment of unrestrained curiosity. He stared out toward the distant horizon, where the sky met the remnants of a shattered world, and let out a hollow laugh.
Gone? My eldest brother, Tommaso, died first. A duel. Foolish pride. Next, Emilio, a fever took him in the winter. He burned for 3 days before he went still. His voice tightened at the memory. Then came the sea as storm swallowed Pietro and Giovanni whole, their ship splintered like driftwood.
He paused, steadying his breath.
Sophie leaned in, her fingers finding his without hesitation.
Massimo, he was reckless, chased excitement like it was air. One night, he rode too fast. Too hard. The horse lost its footing. By the time they found him, his skull, he stopped himself. He never woke up. Then my beloved father died in his sleep. Some say peacefully. But I think he simply gave up.
He looked at her finally, his expression unreadable.
And that left me. The last Angoulême.
I'm sorry, Sophie whispered, the words barely audible above the murmur of the wind.
Don't be. The past does not change.
Their spell was broken by the sound of Josephine's voice, clear and direct, cutting through the hazy warmth that had settled around them.
It's getting late,
she called, brushing dirt from her skirt as she strode toward them with a mixture of urgency and triumph.
We need to return before we're missed. Sophie blinked, as though waking from a dream, the glow of the afternoon slipping from her grasp.
The air between her and Antonio suddenly shifted back to the present. Antonio stood, offering Sophie a hand with an easy grace.
Duty calls.
There was a flicker of reluctance in his expression. Yes, Sophie agreed softly, rising to her feet. Her fingers lingered in his, not wanting to let go, feeling the absence of warmth as he released her hand.
Josephine, clearly pleased with herself, smirked.
Come on then, lovebirds. She teased. I can't keep your reputations intact on my own. Sophie flushed but laughed, grateful for the reprieve from the weight of the moment.
Antonio chuckled, tipping an imaginary hat toward Josephine.
Ever the hero,
he said with mock solemnity. Will you come again? She asked, her voice betraying the hope she tried to suppress.
Antonio's eyes softened, a flicker of amusement playing at the corners of his mouth.
Tomorrow,
he promised quietly.
At noon.
Turning to Josephine with a flourish of practiced elegance, my lady.
Josephine, ever the performer, bobbed a quick, exaggerated curtsy.
My lord.
She replied, her eyes sparkling mischievously.
Sophie groaned, unable to hide her amusement. Honestly, she muttered under her breath.
As Antonio turned back, she instinctively leaned closer. The space between them seemed to contract until his warm exhale brushed her cheek like a shared secret.
My lady,
he murmured, his voice low and deep, rich with something unspoken.
Her heart slammed against her ribs, a betraying rush of warmth flooding through her. My lord. She whispered, her voice husky and unsteady. He lingered, his breath catching just enough for her to notice. Their eyes locked.
Finally, with a grin, Antonio stepped back.
Careful, Lady Sophie,
he said softly, teasing yet unmistakably earnest.
That tone suits you all too well.
Sophie's laugh broke the tension, light and breathless, but it did nothing to douse the heat swirling between them.
The ladies mounted their horses, the ruins fading behind them as they rode back in silence toward the distant silhouette of the castle, the golden hues of sunset stretching across the horizon.
Though they left the airfield, Sophie knew something had shifted, something quietly and irrevocably changed between them.
As the days passed, the bond between Sophie and Antonio deepened.
Each afternoon beneath the crumbling watchtower, they spoke of dreams and uncertainties. Sophie learnt of Antonio's travels, his struggles, and his quiet determination to carve his own destiny. In turn, Sophie confided her own longing, a desire to break free from the castle's cold, confining walls.
He was kind, thoughtful, and unpretentious. And she was falling in love.
Josephine, ever the vigilant sister, noticed the light in Sophie's eyes whenever she spoke of him.
You must be careful,
she warned one evening, her voice low against the distant clamor of the castle's evening bustle.
If father finds out.
I know, Sophie whispered, though the thought of losing these fleeting, tender moments was unbearable.
On one secret afternoon, while Sophie was with Antonio, Josephine wandered the estate alone, keeping out of sight.
The sun hung low, casting long, golden shadows over the manicured lawns. She drifted aimlessly, her mind filled with the gentle hum of thoughts, until, quite unexpectedly, she saw him again.
The dog.
He wasn't where he usually appeared, near the lake or the edges of the gardens. No, today he stood by the staff quarters, a scattering of cottages in an informal circle.
Each with a small garden out front filled with fruit trees and vines. She had always found these enchanting and secretly wished she could live here, away from the main house in quiet contentment.
Yet there he was, the dog, standing still in the half-light of the day as though he belonged there. She wondered if this was his home, had he belonged to one of the farmers?
He stood watching her intently.
Josephine felt a shiver run down her spine.
The feeling was odd, something she couldn't quite name, like she was intruding on his space. A door opening made the dog turn his head. They both glanced up, but no one came out.
Cautiously, she stepped back, her boots crunching softly on scattered pebbles, determined not to disturb this quiet moment. The dog turned to look at her, his amber eyes meeting hers for a brief, silent second.
There was something in those eyes, not quite sadness, but a quiet longing, a yearning for something Josephine couldn't quite grasp.
Do you know something I don't?
She whispered softly.
In response, the dog turned, and padded silently away. Josephine stood frozen for a moment, watching him retreat. She questioned following the animal but had to go to meet Sophie.